Hi, this is Jeffrey Tucker, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You might also consider supporting this podcast by sharing it and even donating. LCI needs your help so it can continue creating great content.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm your host, Doug Stewart, and with me today is special guest Larry Reed. Larry Reed is president of the Foundation for Economic Education, or FEE as it's known. Prior to becoming FEE's president, he served for 20 years as president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, and he also taught economics full-time from 1977 to 1984 at Northwood University in Michigan and chaired his Department of Economics from 1982 to 1984. Reed has been a champion for liberty for decades and has authored over 1,000 newspaper columns and articles and dozens of articles in magazines and journals in the United States and abroad. He's also author of several books. Larry, you've been in the liberty movement for quite a long time. Thanks for being with us. You're just one of the kind of perfect guests to talk about the liberty movement in its sort of history.
Well, thank you, Doug. I'm honored to be with you, and I appreciate your thinking of me.
So give us a little bit of your testimony. How did you get involved in the liberty movement? Did you kind of always consider yourself a libertarian? Where did it start for you?
Well, for me, it began more than 50 years ago when at the age of, I think, 12 or 13, I saw the movie, The Sound of Music. And at that time, I knew nothing about current events or history, but my mother, who took me to that movie, said that, hey, you better learn about this. It's a true story. And I was quite taken by the film because, here was a family, a perfectly good family, just wanted to be left alone. And this nasty foreign regime was trying to take over the country and draft the father into the military. And I realized at that early age that, wow, if this is a true story, then people in certain other countries don't live the same way we do. And that's what started me reading a great deal into history. And then one thing led to another. I took a great interest in the history of liberty. And largely that was from an anti-communist angle once I really started reading, because the communist menace was, very present at that time. But as I read and learned a great deal more, I realized that it's not enough just to be opposed to the use of tanks and force to take over countries. You have to understand your economics, your philosophy, as well as history and morality, and I continued to grow from there. But very early, I decided that this whole matter of liberty, that people should be free, was what was going to motivate me for the foreseeable future, and it turned out to be a lifetime.
That's a really, interesting way to kind of observe, say, a movie and then kind of realize that kind of catapulted you into, being interested in liberty, as well as you say you were taking a great interest in history of liberty and from like anti-communist literature, but it wasn't just enough to be against all the bad things or the really worst kinds of infringements upon liberty. It was also important to be driven by liberty itself.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to have a positive vision. Especially if you're in the business of trying to persuade and convince others. You have to offer something that's exciting, that's optimistic, that says, hey, the world can be a better place. And all you have to do to make it a better place is to get involved on behalf of ideas that you know to be good and to be right. And so I've always had a very positive outlook, a very optimistic perspective, but it really was an anti-communist perspective, building on what I learned about the Nazi takeover of Austria in that movie, that at first motivated me. I've kept that anti-communism, of course. I'm more anti-communist than ever, but I also quickly learned that that's not enough, that you have to have a positive, optimistic vision, and like to think that I do.
Yeah, well, I think we'll probably talk about the anti-communist thing a little bit later in the episode. I really like that take because that's similar to the reasons I was attracted to liberty. I've always been sort of a contrarian, but I kind of grew up conservative, and when I became interested in the liberty movement, it was for all those optimistic reasons, the reasons that, people like Jeffrey Tucker were like, we live in a marvelous world and nobody's pointing this out. And these are all the things we can, just enjoy. And these are all the stupid things the state is doing and that kind of thing. But what I really love about what you said is that it was about making the world a better place or doing things that improve who we are. The one thing that I think a lot of libertarians get into the trap of is being too obsessed with actual political affairs.
Yes.
And not really kind of taking the angle of, personal liberty, like the sphere and domain of like virtue and being a good person. It's kind of a weak way of saying it, but being the kind of person of virtue that takes advantage of freedom in a good way and demonstrates that. I mean, you've written about that in your latest book, I believe. But did political affairs come later? Were you always interested in the politics side, or was it, I know your emphasis is often in like personal liberty rather than, just being anti something communist like?
Yeah. Well, I think the political end of things really was paramount in those early days. And as my understanding broadened, I realized that politics, though important, is something that we ought to de-emphasize, that there are a lot of other things that you're more fully in charge of, that you can make a difference in your life and the lives of those you come into the ability to influence, whether politics goes your way or not. But keep in mind that 50 years ago, 1968, that was a tumultuous year. And based upon all the reading I had done after watching The Sound of Music and learning more about pre-World War II history, here comes 1968 with the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, which is right next door to where the movie was set in Austria. So I took a keen interest in that. But you also had in 1968 a tumultuous presidential election. You had multiple assassinations of prominent figures like Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And it was just an incredible year of importance, of tragedy. And so, yeah, I got caught up in politics because that was the big news of that moment. But my perspective rather quickly broadened as I grew and as I read a lot more.
So next, you said you realized that this would drive you. Your inclination in favor of liberty would drive you in your career and things like that. What does your career look like? Where have you served the liberty movement?
Well, I haven't had a large number of jobs. I've held a few for long periods of time, I'm happy to say. I mean, I've had, as most people do, the typical summer jobs that range everything from everything involving, neighborhood duties, cutting grass, to working at a sewer plant, you name it. But in terms of full-time, long-term, post-schooling career work, I've run think tanks in 3 states, Michigan, the Mackinac Center, for 21 years. Before that, the Center for Market Alternatives in Idaho for 3 years, and now the Foundation for Economic Education for 10 years. I also taught at the university level, Northwood University, for 7 years. That's the first thing I did right out of graduate school, beginning in 1977. So in some sense, I've always been a kind of missionary, whether it be at a think tank or in the classroom, trying to find ways to persuade and convince people. And in my case, my main focus is trying to persuade and convince them of the merits of liberty, free markets, and the most important thing that underpins free markets and liberty, and that is personal character.
Was it easier back then with students to teach the message of liberty? Was it, I mean, the word libertarian probably wasn't as prominent back then. At least that's been my impression, is that, that word is it's not a household name, but people kind of know what it means when you say you're a libertarian. But back then you didn't really, I don't know. What was it like? I guess I don't want to make any assumptions about what it was like. Why don't you tell me?
Well, by the time I started teaching in 1977, I was very familiar with the term libertarian because for almost a decade at that point, I had been reading literature from the Foundation for Economic Education, and that term libertarian was, if not coined, by our founder, Leonard Read, no relation. At least he was one of its most prominent practitioners and somebody who used that term a lot. So I was familiar with it. Now, I started teaching at Northwood University, which was, from the beginning, very friendly territory. It was a school, still is today, committed to ideas of freedom and free markets. It's located in Midland, Michigan. I was attracted there because I knew that I'd have the opportunity to continue to grow in my own understanding and have a friendly environment to share these ideas with students. And I have to say, those 7 years of teaching at Northwood really just gave me an incredible start for my career. As a public speaker, as a teacher, I just learned so much. Just how to relate to people in the classroom. I think I was a far better teacher the year I left than I might have been in the first few months. But nonetheless, that was an incredible experience. And to this day, I still have students, former students, of course, who contact me and say, Mr. Reed, I remember you changed my life. I remember your classes all those decades ago. And that's just a great feeling. And so I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it was great preparation ultimately for running think tanks.
You mentioned that you had been reading material from the Foundation for Economic Education even way back then before you were involved. I think one of the things that, this might be a good time to kind of pivot to one of the other things I wanted to talk about, which is, you've been in the liberty movement for a while. You've also seen a lot of the ways in which the church has either participated in or sort of eschewed the liberty movement. I mean, there's kind of both goes both ways. Have you seen, what sort of evolution have you seen in the church in its posture toward the message of liberty?
Well, I've certainly noticed that among mainline denominations, there is at best an indifference and too often at worst a hostility to a liberty that wasn't there perhaps, at least not to this extent, maybe 150 years ago. That the church in the past has had far more advocates for individual liberty because they saw it as perfectly compatible with Christianity. In fact, even more so, it was ordained by Christianity. But in the last century, you've had the rise of things like liberation theology, and so very different views, very, quote, liberal perspectives that I think actually run counter to the traditional church teaching, and more importantly, to the teachings of Christ himself.
So what about involvement in, were there a lot of Christians involved in some of the early movements at FEE or in some of the other publications that were out there?
Well, for decades at FEE, we had full-time on staff a remarkable man by the name of Reverend Edmund Opitz. I knew Ed very well. I wish I knew off the top of my head exactly how many years he was with FEE, but I think in the neighborhood of 30. And it was his job and his passion to get people to understand that liberty is something that's perfectly compatible with Christianity and, in fact, with many tenets of other faiths as well. But he, in particular, was a Congregationalist minister, so he came at it from that perspective. But at FEE, we've had a long history of people on staff who, if they were not professed Christians, they were at least quite friendly to Christian ideas.
Yeah, we're big fans of Edmund Opitz at LCI. In fact, we have a huge amount of things that he's written that we've republished, things that were kind of able to be republished over the years. So there's quite a few things there. We'll put a link up to that at the show notes page because we're big fans of Edmund Opitz, especially I know Norman Horn is as well.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
And did you ever get to meet him?
Oh, I knew Ed very, very well. Knew him probably 20 years or more. Met him first in 1977. So I would have known him about 20 years because I think he died about 10 or 12 years ago.
Yeah, I never got to really read it. I never got to meet him, of course, and I didn't really read anything by him until probably about 7 or 8 years ago. It actually turned out that the book of his I ordered on Amazon was signed.
Oh,
Like it wasn't advertised as such, but it was.
was that Religion and Capitalism, Allies Not Enemies?
I believe that was it.
Yeah.
Or no, it was a libertarian theology of freedom.
Oh, okay.
It was that one.
That one.
It's like a white book with red lettering and a black and white picture of Ed.
Okay. Oh, well, that's cool.
So let's talk a little bit about your tenure at FEE. You've been there for 10 years now, and I think it's probably not an overstatement to say, and maybe you can kind of correct me if this has happened in the past, but it's been a pretty big decade for the libertarian movement in a number of ways. There's new arguments, there's new inner libertarian spats and all that kind of stuff, but there's a lot of growth, I think,
Yes.
in the liberty movement, as evidenced by a lot of things, including the growth of FEE. So talk a little bit about what you've observed in the last decade or so, and you can go back further than that if you need to, but just talk to us about that.
The movement for liberty has grown incredibly in the last decade. We still need to grow so much more, though, and sometimes I wonder if the other side is growing a little faster than we are. But I'm still very optimistic about the future. But when I look at the last decade, I see the growth of not only new organizations, think tanks devoted to liberty, but the literature has expanded immensely. At FEE, we've gone from a situation where we were on the verge of going out of business a decade ago to where we've had such remarkable growth. We're now one of the leaders again in the liberty movement worldwide. And that's by any measure, by unique visitors to the website, by engagements in social media, by sheer volume of content, by numbers of people who interact with FEE in an in-person way at events all over the world. You name it. We've come a long way in just 10 years. And to a great extent, we've seen that kind of growth elsewhere in the movement, too.
What do you think the role of the internet has played in the advance of liberty? I mean, it's almost like a setup question here. it's big, of course, but why has it been big? Because I think that's been part of FEE's success, too.
Well, I think that here I am doing a podcast with you, and you're in what state?
I'm in Pennsylvania.
Okay, you're in Pennsylvania, my home state, by the way. I'm in Georgia, and you're exposing what I'm having to say to lots of new people, and the internet has done that for us. At FEE, I can speak more knowledgeably about how we've adapted to it. We've actually discontinued the hard copy magazine that we were known for decades, called the Freeman, and instead have put almost everything we do online. At its peak, the Freeman was getting about 50,000 subscribers a month, but now we have about 1.5 million unique visitors to the website every month, and tens of thousands of more people all over the world who are attending our events. So through the use of technology, the internet being principal among the devices of technology today, we're reaching far more people than we ever did before, just a few years ago.
How's the method of communication outside of the medium itself, the sort of the rhetorical changes? I guess I'm thinking about the rhetorical changes of making the case for liberty. How has that changed when you reach out to people who aren't libertarians, or maybe they're sort of interested? Like, what has changed, and what has worked differently in your opinion?
There's so much competing for people's attention these days, and their attention spans, I think, on balance, are getting shorter. What that means is that you cannot expect people to sit down as we used to and read 300-page books, one or two every month or so. You have to reach them in more brief formats, whether it be by video or social media in posts or shorter articles on the website. So everything we do today is aimed at very busy people who have shorter and shorter attention spans. So we have to get, as we have, increasingly better at making our points in a short period of time.
Man, I'd be happy if people would read a short article. I think the attention span at this stage is like meme length.
Exactly. So we're even doing some of those. which, I don't think in the Freeman in decades we ever had a cartoon. But look at the instance today of memes. I mean, they're used by everybody.
Yeah. What about the actual content of some of that message? When you reach out to somebody on the left or somebody on the right, I mean, that has to change over. I mean, the left and the right, and I kind of use those categories just because that's kind of how we talk about things. They've changed too. I mean, the right from 20 years ago is very different from what it looks like today, especially in a post-Trump era. And the left is incredibly different. And so the arguments you make probably have changed. I mean, what have you observed in that phenomenon?
I think there's probably good and bad in what's happened, what's evolved over recent years. On the side of concerns, who hasn't noticed the increasing polarization, the nastiness that I don't think we saw in public discussion to anywhere near the extent that we see it today. There's just an erosion of what I still call the presumption of goodwill, where people who have disagreements can still have civil discussion. But now you just never know what somebody might find offensive at the drop of a hat, even though no offense is intended. And you have to be short and sweet and sensitive, more so than ever before. But we do have more media, more opportunities to put our message in front of people than we've ever had before. So we just have to be more careful in what we say and how we say it, although the core arguments, the principles are the same, at least at FEE, today as they were when FEE was founded more than 70 years ago.
So when somebody asks you, they might know that you're a Christian and then they realize that you're a libertarian, or you tell them what you do and they're like, wow, you're a Christian and a libertarian. What's your, I mean, to somebody like me and probably like you're like, well, this just seems to fit. And there's a lot of listeners out there where they're just like, well, it seems to fit in my mind, and I've worked out all of the major components of what might possibly be incompatible, and I've made those work. Or maybe it comes more naturally to some people. But, I know a lot of people are like, well, how do I tell other people that this just is compatible because of, X, Y, and Z? What makes those two things compatible for you? I mean, you've lived this way for a long time, and this is just part of who you are. For a lot of us, it's relatively new for many people. So what do you tell people when they ask, really, how can you do both?
That's funny you should raise that, because it has happened to me many times. There is a general reaction out there that so many people think that to be for liberty, or to be a libertarian and to be a Christian, somehow poses a dilemma or a conflict. And I'm usually quick to express, I usually come back and say, why would you even question why liberty and Christianity might be incompatible? I mean, after all, the most important thing that a person within the Christian faith has to decide in his lifetime is whether or not to accept Christ as Savior. That's a very personal and voluntary choice, and everything else flows from there. Everything else is less important in life, but every bit as subject to personal discernment and decision making. I mean, you and I were created as unique individuals. That in itself suggests to me that to be fully human, to be fully who you are, and to be fully who I am, we have to be granted considerable freedom to live our lives. I mean, otherwise, you're not living your life. You're living somebody else's life who's telling you what to do at every turn.
Hey, folks, Norman Horn here from LCI. Would you do us a quick favor and rank us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe to us? High rankings help us get the word out. And now let's get back to the show.
Yeah, well, Larry, you've actually written about this. In fact, when LCI has visited various conferences and met up with certain people, we actually have this pamphlet that's produced by FEE. It's called "Rendering Unto Caesar: Was Jesus a Socialist?" And people can find that on FEE's website. And it's pretty short. I mean, printed out, it's 11 pages here. I actually have it right here. It's 11 pages, and it's a great tract, if you will, to kind of give to people. So what's the gist of that? I mean, was Jesus a socialist? I mean, we hear that a lot because it sounds like all the things, the message of the kingdom and the Sermon on the Mount. I mean, if Jesus were telling all of that to to politicians, you might get the impression that he's telling them to be socialist.
Well, you have to start with an understanding of what socialism is. A lot of people seem to think socialism is just people sharing things with each other, or that it's government doing nice things to people or for people, that it's welfare programs which help people in need and that sort of thing. But what differentiates socialism from every other system of economic organization and from its principal competitor, capitalism, is the fact that it's based on force. It's not voluntary. In fact, if it's voluntary, I like to tell people that it's not socialism. Socialists don't give speeches and say, "Why don't you all choose voluntarily to behave a certain way?" They have a litany of government programs that they want to impose upon people, whether it be for the redistribution of wealth, or the central planning of an economy, or the state ownership of the means of production. All of that requires the use of political force. It seems to me you can scour the New Testament and not find a single word, let alone a sentence, from Jesus that would suggest he would support the concentration of power and money in the hands of government. He had other things in mind. And you look at one parable after another that he tells, from the Good Samaritan story to the parable of the talents to the parable of the workers in the vineyard. Time and again, the bottom line message is entirely compatible with voluntarism and a free market or capitalism.
So let me play a little bit of devil's advocate, because every democratic socialist friend that I have who posts Bernie memes and I think it's Cortez is her last name, the one that defeated in a primary one of the Democratic incumbents in, I think, New York. But anyway, the biggest thing that I get is from them is, you guys don't understand. We're not socialists. We're democratic socialists. So what they're gonna say is that they're not for the kind of socialism that impose things from the top down. They're socialists that allow the people, whatever that means, the people to decide what other the people. Okay, it already breaks apart just in this description. Get to be or get to do, and therefore, if you're part of society, we're going to democratically choose, or we're going to democratically decide, and again, whatever that means, this is what's good for the country, or this is what's good for this community, or large scale society. And so they don't like it when we say that we kind of focus on the socialism part. Yeah. So there's this sort of evolution in the way that the term has been used. Like, I don't know a lot of common folk who or popular level arguments for socialism or for democratic socialism that are actual what we have historically known as socialism. Now, I do know that there is an actual platform for democratic socialists that do talk about the state-owned means of production and things like that. But the average person who's advocating for this, the ones who aren't just caught up in, oh, it sounds nice, let me be for that. Yeah. I'm talking about the people who have probably thought through this. And I have a few friends, not all of them, but a few friends who are like, they're committed to this, and some of them are Christians. What's wrong with democratic socialism? I mean, that sounds better than democratic capitalism, which has been a term that's thrown around as well.
Well, ultimately, in the long run, democratic socialism, those two words, basically, they are an oxymoron, because the more you concentrate power and money in the hands of the state, and that's what their platform calls for. They want far more government than we presently have today. They want to concentrate power and money in the hands of politicians. The more you do that, the less likely you will ever retain the democratic elements. This is one of the essential lessons, I think, of history, that if you want to preserve democracy, that is widespread popular participation in government, the last thing you want to do is to make government so big, so important in the lives of everybody, that all of us are fighting each other, trying to either get in charge of it or to either because we want to use it to our own personal advantage, or we want to keep it at bay because it has such power to use against us. You concentrate power and money in the hands of the state, you sooner or later will erode the very pillars of democracy that democratic socialists say they so strongly support. One of the lessons of America's founding, if our founders were present on this podcast right now, I think they'd be quick to say, they would say, look, we understood what happens when government is extraordinarily powerful. You can't expect it to be democratic. Sooner or later, the temptations of power will corrupt the system and deprive ordinary people of access to government or access to policy, and people who are exercising power will reign supreme. So that's the dilemma that every democratic socialist has to face. They're promising conflicting objectives. It's one or the other, democracy or socialism. You can't, in the long run, have them both.
Yeah, and their comeback would be that, and I love to hear people's responses to this, so I don't want to get yours as well, is that, well, as it is now, and I realize we're in sort of a cronyism kind of environment more so than unfettered capitalism, but their idea of unfettered capitalism will yield the people who have power, like the few will have power because they get wealthy. They're already bemoaning the income inequality or the money inequality gap, which can be a meaningless statistic depending on how you want to be measuring things. But these people are going to say, well, without the state somehow keeping the powerful in the market in check, then those who are powerful in the market are going to become the de facto concentration of power that you talked about.
What they don't seem to understand is that the powerful, the well-connected, the already wealthy, they will be the ones who have the greatest access to a government that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You cannot have big government and good government at the same time. The bigger it is, the greater the temptations of those wielding power to take advantage of it, to gain connections and power and money for themselves. There's nothing about government that says, once you go to it and become a representative or a bureaucrat, that suddenly your angelic character comes out. I mean, what happens is that the temptations of power are eternally corrupting. So if you really want to keep people from using the power of their wealth to control others, the last thing you want to do is give them access to a political machine that allows them to do things they could never get accomplished in a free marketplace.
Yeah, in a free market, those people who are in power are often never the same over the course of decades, but doing what you're describing would institutionalize the access to power if you have money.
Exactly. I mean, look at today at the here at the start of the 21st century, you've got government in the United States that's many times bigger as a share of our national income than it was 100 years ago. And you'd think that democratic socialists would say, well, I'm happier today than I was 75 or 100 years ago. No. I mean, we've largely done an awful lot of what they wanted. We've grown government immensely. And if anything, they're less happy with it today than ever before. What they don't understand is that all this corruption, the wielding of power, the crushing of the little guy, is being made possible and being institutionalized by a government that they helped grow.
Yeah, their one line response to that is Ronald Reagan.
Oh yeah.
They think that Ronald Reagan deregulated everything and instituted a wild, wild west.
Yeah, they love bumper stickers. They really do, and it's one of our problems is getting democratic socialists to actually understand reason, facts, logic, experience, history, economics. They live by bumper stickers.
Has anybody ever asked you, well, is there ever been any sort of successful libertarian country that you could point to make me be intrigued by this idea that we should have a free society?
I can give you two examples, and these are examples of spots on the world. I use that instead of the word country because in the case of one, it really wasn't its own country, but at least a jurisdiction where they adopted free markets and they took a terrible situation and quickly made it one of the most prosperous in the world. One is Hong Kong, right after World War II. While the mother country Great Britain went in a socialist direction, its colony at that time, Hong Kong, went very much in a free market direction. And they went from about 750,000 people to about 8 million today. And from a per capita income that was way below the world average to now one that's way above the world average. And they did it entirely through a pursuit of free markets with incredibly low taxes, no tariffs, no minimum wage, minimal government interference. And another good example is Germany right after World War II. I mean, you had a country that was devastated, defeated, flattened, destroyed. It just had gone through a decade and a half of national socialism. It was occupied by foreign powers, several million refugees pouring into it from the East, and so forth. Terrible situation. And yet, within a decade, by 1960, or even late 50s, Germany became an economic powerhouse and the most prosperous country in Western Europe. Why? Largely because of Ludwig Erhard, their finance minister, later chancellor, who decontrolled the economy, introduced a sound currency, balanced the budget, reduced taxes and tariffs. And, we spoke of it in the 1950s as the German economic miracle. Lots of Americans knew about it at that time, and today you don't hear so much about it. But it was a miraculous economic recovery from total devastation, and it was entirely because of freedom and free markets.
So you've actually mentioned a few people along the way, and talking about your journey and your experiences at FEE. Who are some of your who do you look up to in the liberty movement, either currently or people in the past?
In the past, certainly the leading scholars that I revere are people like Henry Hazlitt, a great economist and a longtime member of the FEE Board of Trustees, Ludwig von Mises of the Austrian School of Economics, and his student F.A. Hayek, a Nobel Prize winner and Austrian economist. Going back a little further, Frederick Bastiat. I think there's been no better storyteller in the history of liberty than the French economist Frederick Bastiat, who lived in the first half of the 19th century. Those are giants, and so they're among my heroes. In the political sphere, I'm always disappointed with politics. So all these names come with their flaws. But in my lifetime, Ronald Reagan was the best president since I've been alive. Margaret Thatcher was the best British prime minister in the last half century. And that was because they did a great deal to deregulate and introduce market reforms, and success speaks for itself. In both cases, the economies of Britain and the United States, as a result of their policies, blossomed. So I have great respect for them too, as well as those scholars I mentioned.
So what do you think about the future of the liberty movement, or the future? Actually, let's make it broader. What do you think about the future of our society? I mean, you said you're an optimist, so I'm guessing you're going to go in that direction. But I mean, do you have some things that are concerning that, could change your optimism if we don't take them seriously?
I don't think there's anything that could change me from an optimist to a pessimist. And if for no other reason than nobody knows the future for sure. It can turn on a dime. And there are a lot of good people, more than at any time in my lifetime, who are working full time to make for a better and freer future. We just don't know how or when that might evolve. But I do know that the moment you become pessimistic, two bad things happen. Number one, you don't work as hard for what you know to be right if you've already given up. And secondly, you're not going to be as persuasive or convincing of others to embrace ideas of liberty if you even suggest that we're on the losing side. So I think the future is bright, because I have no reason at this point to think otherwise, because I don't know the future. So I'm an eternal optimist. There's no reason to be pessimistic. It's a self-fulfilling and destructive prophecy to be pessimistic about the future.
Do you think that goes into people's way of arguing about liberty? Because, it's easy on Facebook to just bemoan everything that's going wrong. I mean, you think it's good to be an optimist in the sense that this is the kind of angle we should take in promoting liberty rather than being the naysayers all the time?
Well, I do believe that, but I think I'd still be an optimist even if that weren't the case. But there's no question that most people want to be on the side of what they think is the winner or the winning idea. And they like to think that it's a winning idea because it's a good idea. And I'd make a very strong case that liberty is both, that it's the best idea for how people should live and interact and interrelate with each other. And it's also, I think, the ultimate victor. People will be free sooner or later. It may come at different stages and to varying degrees in different places. But ultimately, I think our ideas of individual liberty are so far superior to central planning, central control, concentrating power in the hands of politicians, that it's only a matter of time before we prevail. There may be bumps along the way. I'm sure there will be. But it's too good an idea for humanity to ignore forever.
Yeah, I agree. That was very well said. It's too good of an idea. That's really wonderful. So, what's next for you in your career? What should people who look you up on Fee and kind of start following what you do? You writing a book? Where's your career going?
This is the year I turn 65, and it's also the year that I have announced that pending the choice of a successor, that I'll step into the President Emeritus role. That could happen yet this year, or if it takes a little longer to find a successor, it might be in 2019. But in any event, as President Emeritus of Fee, I will be every bit as active as I have been for the past 10 years. I'll just be less involved in the day-to-day administrative duties of Fee, and hopefully I'll have more time for speaking and for writing. I love to write. In fact, that's a major motivation for me in getting into the liberty movement 50 years ago. I wanted to be primarily a writer and secondarily a speaker. But, when you run a think tank, you've got to fundraise, you've got to attend to day-to-day administrative duties and so forth. I just like to step back and have more time to write. So, yes, there are several books I have in mind and a lot of articles.
Well, that's great. I'm going to link on our show notes page to your bio page on Fee and any other articles that we can, or any other kind of pages that we can link to so that people can get in touch with you. And thanks for being with us. It's been great to have this conversation about the liberty movement, about arguing with people who misunderstand Jesus's politics, kind of get some ideas out there and stuff. So thanks for being with us.
Hey, thank you, Doug. Anytime. I love libertarian Christians, and I wish you every success.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you liked today's episode, we encourage you to rate us on Apple Podcasts to help expand our audience. If you want to reach out to us, email us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com. You can also reach us at LCI Official on Twitter. And of course, we are on Facebook and have an active group you are welcome to join. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. The audio engineers were Doug Stewart and Jason Rink, and voiceovers were by Matthew Bellis and Caitlin Horn. If you'd like to find out more about the LCI, please visit us on the web at www.libertarianchristians.com.